Hello, everybody, and welcome to another PureDriven podcast. Today I'm joined with Christopher Swanson, the CEO of PureDriven, and we're going to talk about one of our three uniques here. We're going to talk about active management. So, Chris, this is the second of the three uniques that we've talked about on the show. What can you tell me about active management?
Well, Steve, it's a wonderful topic, but first I need to start out by saying I really like your wardrobe today. Very well dressed.
Thank you.
Steve is a fashion, what do they say, like a clothes horse, I think is the term I've heard.
I like fashionista.
Looking good. Great to be back on the podcast, Steve, and so appreciative of you inviting me here to do this. Yes, uniques within a business is something that we talk about a lot. How is your business unique, and how are you doing things differently? And one of the things PureDriven does that is extremely important is active management. And I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about that today, Steve. I think that's kind of the subject of or the topic, I guess, of what we want to talk about. And it's a great conversation to have, especially around digital and social marketing.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the big thing is when you look at a traditional agency versus a modern agency in the digital world, I think active management is what really sets them apart, because a lot of the traditional radio, TV ads, there's not much active management that goes on. You kind of give them your ad and then that's about it. If they send you a report after, awesome, but they probably don't. So in the digital world, you can actually monitor all these things basically live while they're happening, which means you get real insights into what's going on and you get to change stuff. So I think that's really where active management comes in, is you're actually changing things as the ads are running and not waiting for you to spend all your money and then going, I should have changed that.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we see a lot in our industry. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of traditional agencies moving in to compete, which is fine. I mean, it's a competitive marketplace. One of the things that we always talk with our clients about is what does the active management look like? And usually when you peel back that onion and you start getting kind of deep into, question number 3 of how often are you touching or making adjustments to the campaign or reviewing and kind of assessing the campaign, often the wheels start coming off for a lot of agencies because their systems are used to, as you described earlier, a set it and forget it model. Where you set it up once a month or maybe even longer and you kind of walk away and you hope for the best. I guess I'm not into gambling that way with my clients' money. And what happens is if you also understand active management, you realize that digital, local, social, these things actually perform better when they have active management behind them.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of the time when it comes to that social side of things, you need to be really in the moment and kind of capitalizing on what's going on in the marketplace, in the local area. And if you're trying to do stuff 6 months ahead of time, it's going to be really hard to actually get the stuff at the right time. The right message at the right time is really hard to do when you're trying to plan 6 months ahead of time.
Absolutely. Recency is such an important part of marketing today.
Yeah, definitely.
And people describe recency differently, but for the purpose of this podcast, so everybody understands where I'm coming from, it's how long between seeing an actual advertisement or social media post or content before they actually see the physical location, whether that's a restaurant or a gas station. And so that it's top of mind awareness is the term we used to use quite a bit. But it works. If that recency is there and people see something that's attractive and then they happen to drive by a restaurant, there's a good chance that might click and causing them to take that action that's so important. But putting that right message in front of the right people at the right time requires a discipline that a lot of traditional agencies struggle with. Even some digital agencies that we've looked at and audited struggle with, because the model has to be such, it's very time intensive. You have to be looking at a lot of information and making adjustments on the fly. And so active management is something that's not easy. It's also important to point out that active management is something that you have to really define what that means in the trenches, so the details of it. For example, on Facebook, active management might be simply commenting, reviewing as you're putting content out. If you're on the advertising side of it, it might be making the adjustments to the ad as the ad's going on a daily basis. For active management for a display remarketing campaign has a totally different feel. A lot of times with display remarketing, it's about the impressions, the click-through ratio. So you're paying close attention to what does that look like? How many times is my ad showing up? And then what is the click-through ratio looking like? How many people have seen that ad? Who's actually engaged that ad? And I can go through each marketing channel out there and talk about what active management looks like. But as you can imagine, that coupled with paying attention to analytics, knowing what the engagement was, what's happening, is very time intensive. And this model that we come from, which is a set it and forget it model, and not us personally, we kind of grew up in the digital and social world, but a lot of agencies have come from that model. They struggle to actually do that. And one of the most common things I hear from people all the time, clients and agencies, is, man, I remember when advertising used to be easy. It's become so fragmented and so complicated and difficult that people start to think that active management is just one more headache of things that they have to do. It's not a headache, and that's the point I want to make today. It is so critical for the success and engagement of people that are going to, that recency thing we talked about, people that are going to engage your brand. And so you really have to stay on top of that, and you have to really be focused on active management.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm not going to touch too much on it, but speaking of the fragmented marketing, there's actually businesses out there that basically make a link between all these different platforms, and that's all their business is a link between all these other platforms, because there's so many marketing things going on that they don't all connect with each other. So there's companies that legitimately just make a software that links everything together, and it's still almost impossible to keep track of if you're not really on top of it and organized. So
yeah, well, the good news is there are some tools out there that can help you with some of these things. Mm-hmm. What we find pretty consistently is kind of what you talked about, is that there's so many different moving parts that no one tool can solve everything, nor would you want it to.
Yep.
But actually, it's even more complicated than that. Most of the time, we find that most tools are good at doing one thing well, and then as you try to get them to do other things, they are really poor at it. And that's just kind of life in general, right? I mean, you have people who are specialists, and then you have generalists. And I'm not going to say that the generalists are poor at it, but they're not great at it. They're good. If you want great, then you have to start looking at tools that do all these different things, which again adds to another level of complexity. Yep. Digital marketing today, Steve, and social marketing is not easy by any means. And on top of that, the active management is critical, so it makes it even more time intensive and even more manual than you would think when you're dealing with technological products.
Yep, definitely. So I think that's about it for active management. That really sums up really what active management is and why it is one of our uniques at PureDriven, because we really do emphasize that we have all of our technicians as the specialist in the product that they work on. They know exactly how they're supposed to manage those products every month, and we really try and hand that value over to our clients, because all of our products are priced differently, and a lot of that pricing is to do with the active management that goes into it.
Yeah, that's excellent, Steve. Just one last point before we conclude this podcast. We have consistently worked with people, and we talk about our proven process, and we talk about the uniqueness of PureDriven, how active management is so critically important, and it's something that's unique that we do. One of the things that we find is just the simplicity of doing a post on Facebook over and over again, which is actually fairly easy, is very difficult if day in and day out you're trying to run a business. And so often we work with clients that say, hey, I think I've got this now. I'm ready to take on Facebook or Instagram or whatever it might be. And while we're okay with that, we educate and we share kind of the details around how to be successful with that. We also just want to make you aware, we go back and actually study how many people keep up with it. And it's less than 10% are actually able to keep up on a daily basis, or the time frames that we suggest for active management for each one of those advertising channels. Yep. So less than 10%. Think about that. Why is that? Well, it's simply because of the complication, how difficult it is to do. So that's just a point I wanted to make, Steve, as we talk about this with people and as people are listening to this podcast. Find somebody that knows how to do active management well. Find a person that's going to do those details over and over again, because that's 9/10 of the battle.
Yep, definitely. Well, thank you, Chris. And Chris will be here again when we talk about local marketing, our third unique. So please make sure to follow the podcast, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Steve. Have a great day, everybody.